So I'm Fritz Mayer. I'm the dean here at the Korbel School. So my pleasure to welcome all of you this evening to our session on recapping the 2024 legislative session, which as always is a lot to talk about. Great thanks and to the Colorado Sun for partnering with us this evening. This really their event, meeting the speakers, lending their expertise. We're just delighted to partner with the Sun, both in this event and in the past on co-hosting Secretary of State and Treasurer debates. I'm really looking forward to co-hosting the Sun Fest in September, so stay tuned for that. You may want to heard about that, which is a day-long event bringing Coloradans together with some of the top thought leaders in the state to discuss topics including politics, the environment, education, among others. Before going further, as we do here, just to acknowledge that we meet here at the University of Denver on land that is the ancestral home of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations, and that we honor their elders, past and present. So thanks to all of you for being here this evening. Some of our students, faculty, staff, but particularly all the members of the community who are here. And particular thanks to our Scrivner Institute of Public Policy and the Center on American Politics for hosting this discussion. So Director Naz Barmer directs the Scrivner Institute, Professor Seth Maskett, Director of the Center of American Politics, and most importantly, Katie Aker and Megan Grogan, who are the key staff who are probably out there. But anyway, thanks to them. They do, of course, all the work. You may wonder why School of International Studies is hosting this. It's kind of an archaic term because increasingly we are a School of Public and International Affairs, and we're really committed, as we say, to being global to local, anchoring everything that we do on all the issues in what is happening here in Colorado and in Denver. And so Scrivner and CAP in particular do a lot of programming on Colorado policy and politics. And it is increasingly something that we try to do is be, a citizen of this state. Tonight's event will highlight how our state legislature has reckoned with the challenges of finding common ground and compromise to move policies forward. And we'll hear where they were successful, maybe some ways they weren't successful this evening. At its essence, policy is the purpose of it is to improve people's lives, and we rely on elected officials to do that work, especially on challenging topics. And so, a great conversation this evening. I must say that due to security concerns this evening, Governor Polis will not be with us in person. I'm sorry for that. He will be live streaming in very shortly. And I would say in general, we have all the speakers here this evening. We have, are here for a limited amount of time. So we want to make sure we hear from all of them and obviously urge that we all be respectful of the speakers and refrain from interrupting them. Anyway, we look forward to hearing from some of Colorado Sun's politics team in conversation with different elected officials. And we really appreciate those officials for taking their time to engage this evening with our community. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand off to the editor of the Colorado Sun, Larry Rickman. Larry.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you all for coming out tonight. And again, thanks to everyone here at DU and the Korbel School and to our sponsors at Aponte Busam to make this event possible. But ultimately, our members are what makes events like this possible and our journalism possible. We founded the Colorado Sun nearly 6 years ago because we felt Colorado deserved something better, and that we are very proud to have the support of so many Coloradans. And we want to encourage you, if you aren't already members, to become a member. Hopefully there's a QR code somewhere that will magically appear on a screen behind me. And we just became a nonprofit at the end of 2023. So if you would like to further fuel our journalism and make events like this possible, make our journalism possible, we would be proud to accept your support and promise we'll work hard to earn it. So As the dean said, I'll keep my remarks short. We have a great program tonight. We will get started here in a moment, and I will turn it over to Jesse Paul. Thank you again for coming out, and look forward to meeting many of you afterwards. I'll be around to chat with anyone who would like to. So thank you very much.
All right, well, hopefully we are live in the ballroom. Thank you so much, Governor Polis, for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Appreciate you switching at the last moment here to join us. I just want to, let's jump into the conversation because we only have 30 minutes here, and there's a lot to talk about after the session that wrapped up on Wednesday last week. And I want to start off with property taxes. The legislature in the final days of the session passed Senate Bill 233, which provides rate and value relief in perpetuity for Colorado homeowners and businesses. But it wasn't enough to stop conservative groups from pursuing their own ballot measures in the fall that would offer deeper cuts, bigger relief. And now Denver Chamber CEO J.J. Ament this week called on you to broker a better deal before November. So I guess my first question is there a better deal to be had? And would you be open to a special session, which would really be the only way to make that deal possible?
Well, first of all, thanks to Larry Rickman, Dean Fritz Mayer, appreciate it. DU, thank you for hosting this. And Jesse, good to see you. This was amazing to see this work of the bipartisan commission. This was an idea, and this topic we could talk about for half an hour, Jesse, and you know this, and we'll try to do it in, I guess, 4 or 5 minutes because we want to talk about other things. But real quickly, how we got here, 2 things. The voters repealed the Gallagher Amendment. The Gallagher Amendment did one thing well, 2 things poorly. One thing it did well, kept home taxes down. 2 things it did poorly, it jacked up prices for small businesses over time, and it would have gotten worse. And 2 is it applied a Metro Denver formula on 4,000 special districts, the vast majority of which are rural, and had no impact. Had no corresponding to the reality of like what they were actually facing tax-wise, because just because homes go up in Denver doesn't mean that homes go up in value in Julesburg. The second thing, that was one thing. The second thing was what I would call a unprecedented assessment period. We had 2-year period. We assess homes every 2 years, where home values went up about 40% average statewide. So absent action, property taxes would go up 40%. Doesn't mean the rate went up. It means that your house is worth more. A $600,000 house might be worth $1 million, so people pay more. So we didn't think it was a good outcome. And when I say we, I mean Democrats, Republicans, most people with common sense, didn't think it was a good outcome that people should have to pay that full amount of their home value increasing. And so there's been a number of efforts to provide short-term relief. 3, and if I'm not mistaken, 2 of them were bipartisan and 1 wasn't. After HH failed, they came in, provided short-term relief. In fact, the main issue Republicans had with that at the time was this is not permanent. And Democrats agree, this wasn't permanent. We were just had to put nobody was pretending it wasn't a Band-Aid. It was a Band-Aid. Everybody knew we had to provide a permanent way to provide relief, or rates would have gone up, what people paid would have gone up right away, because we did real quickly, we dropped the assessment rate. We also let everybody deduct $50,000 from the value of their home. So if you had a $600,000 home, you only paid taxes on $550, but that was only for 1 year. It would have gone back up to $600, and the rate would have jumped. So that looming situation got Democrats and Republicans to work together over the long haul. In fact, adding a commission, a bipartisan commission, to the special session was the idea of Senator Pelton, a Republican from Eastern Colorado. The Democrats, and I believe it was Senator Mullica, worked with him on that. And the commission was broadly representative, Jesse. I think they did a very good job. They had local government people. They had actually more Republicans than Democrats. Not that it matters, but they had unaffiliated. They had business representatives. They had everybody working hard towards the shared goal of reducing property taxes and providing homeowners insurance in the long term they wouldn't come up. So it wasn't clear that they would lead to an outcome that Republicans and Democrats would support. They worked, they met. The commission itself voted overwhelmingly to endorse a certain way of moving forward. And then from that base of work, legislators picked it up. Lisa Frizzell, who was on the commission, Senator Barb Kirkmeyer, those two happen to be Republicans, Senator Chris Hansen, who chaired the commission, Representative Chris DeGree Kennedy, and others sort of picked it up and said, let's get this across the finish line. I mean, doing nothing is not an answer. And they did. And to their great credit, they worked on the largest tax relief in the history of Colorado, $1.3 billion, not only allowing up to $70,000 to be reduced from the value of your home for taxation. Now it's 10%. So if it's a $500,000 home, it's $50,000. But if it's an $800,000 or $700,000 home, you reduce the value for taxation by $70,000, but also reduce the rate, and then capped at 5.5% growth most property taxes going forward. Meaning, if God forbid there ever is another assessment period where it goes up 40%, and I don't think the one next year will be that way, Jesse. I don't think homes haven't gone up 40% in the last 2 years, but you always want to be future-proof. And so if that happens again, there'll be an automatic mechanism where homeowners won't feel the brunt of it. Now, second part of your question, do other people out there think property taxes should be higher, lower? I mean, I'm sure it's a great big state. I'm sure there's people who think that people should be paying more, and there's people that think they should be paying less. But the fact is, 57 out of 65 members of the state House, 33 out of 35 members of the state Senate, overwhelming majority, Republicans, Democrats, really doing the work that people sent them to Denver to do, and creating a thoughtful way to keep property taxes low, as well as provide our small businesses a lot of relief.
Okay, so I'll take that as a no to the special session. I mean, is there a better deal to be had? Obviously, the conservative groups want these ballot measures in November. It sounds like you feel like this is the best deal.
Well, look, I mean, in this kind of situation, it's not that the governor's office is not driving this. We're for, and we let, early on legislators know, I mean, I'm for any tax relief they pass. And so if Democrats or Republicans, have additional pieces to do, they can do them in January and I think that's the spirit everybody brings to it. I don't think Senator Hansen and Senator Kirkmeyer think that, property taxes, we're never talking about again. I think everybody believes there's more work to do. And I am very supportive of what they can agree on and do, and whenever that is. And so, if it saves people money, you've heard me say that number of areas, save people money on healthcare, save people money on housing, save people money on taxes. I mean, wherever it is. And I, by the way, view property taxes as part of that housing equation. We're going to get into housing, I'm sure. And it's certainly not the main driver of housing costs in Colorado, to be clear. And I think anybody who says that property taxes are the main reason homes cost too much, not true, but they are a driver, absolutely. And so we need to address all drivers of why it costs too much to live in Colorado. Property taxes is one of those. And of course, I celebrate the bipartisan progress the legislature made, and we welcome additional work in this issue in the years ahead.
To be fair, I mean, the legislature can call itself into a special session, but you also have that power. But I do want to move on to one last question.
Well, no, again, I mean, if they agree on something and come to me, and Barb Kirkmeyer and Chris Hansen are saying, we want to do it now instead of January for some reason, of course we're open to that. Their caucuses have to be with them and so forth. But again, I would hope we can get back to it in January. But if there's a reason or a desire among legislators to do more work on it, as governor, we're always happy to support that work.
Okay. Moving on to housing, as you talked about, more specifically housing, land use. That was the way, you're really trying to boost affordable housing in Colorado and make our air cleaner and improve the environment across the state. The legislature passed about 6 bills in this area this year, but they were all pretty limited in scope. They applied to metropolitan areas, around transit stops. I wonder if you think in future years the legislature should try to broaden them, right? Obviously, not every part of Colorado has bus and rail, but every part of Colorado there could be ADUs, every part of Colorado there could be parking mandates. Is there room for all of these to be expanded?
So 2 things. First of all, I personally support these measures being applied to address the housing crisis across our state. Now, I want to push back a little when you said they don't apply to much of the state. That may be what it looks like geographically. But for instance, something like eliminating parking requirements, I read that that's about 70% of the population of the state, something like that, or maybe 70% of the population of the Front Range that applies to, because it's people who live near a bus stop or rail stop within half a mile, and the majority of the Front Range residents do. ADUs, most of our state, not geographically, because again, most of our state is empty geographically. It's mountains, but by population, most cities, the Denver metro area, Colorado Springs metro area, accessory dwelling units. So absolutely, it's more than material in addressing the housing issue. And at the same time, you're correct. It doesn't necessarily affect depending on which bill it is, 10, 20, 30, 40% of the state. But they are very material. They address the highest cost housing areas around Denver, around Colorado Springs, Pueblo, and they're a big part of the solution. And again, I support expanding them, and I know many members of the legislature do as well.
One of the things that the press corps was really scratching its head about was, yes, these apply to the Denver metro area and Grand Junction, and in one case, the Roaring Fork Valley, when you're talking about the transit-oriented communities bill, but mountain communities, Summit County, Steamboat, Durango, were basically left out of these. And I wonder, if land use isn't the solution there, what is? And if you can maybe talk about why these communities were left out of these measures. Was it politics? What happened there?
Well, again, I start by saying, of course, I personally support including solutions like accessory dwelling units by right in mountain communities, absolutely. And I would add that there are many mountain communities are leading the way. I was with the mayor of Steamboat Springs, and he has an ADU in his own house that he rents out, and they have a big initiative to try to get them built across town. One reason that the state can be helpful, even in a very pro-ADU jurisdiction, is the local jurisdictions can't overcome HOAs that by covenant prohibit accessory dwelling units, whereas the state can, because HOAs are, of course, a product of state statutes. So one tool that the state can provide, and again, I have to go back and look at the bills, Jesse. I believe these communities can opt in to these bills. We hope they do. And in doing so, we would hope that then they can make sure that homeowners that live in HOAs can, in fact, build accessory dwelling units. HOAs are very substantial in our state. About 40% of the homes are members of a homeowners association. And they have their very important role. And as I like to say, they can determine, your accessory dwelling unit has to be, one of 3 colors. You might have to have a certain window dressing, but they can't say you can't build it. And I think that's important as we look statewide towards housing solutions.
I have a partial ADU in my backyard, so I'm looking forward to expanding that. I do want to nail down, though, on the mountain communities, right? I mean, there was a conscious decision not to include them. Yes, they can opt in, but was it political pressure from those communities that made you decide that they shouldn't be part of this? I mean, was it unpassed?
Well, it wasn't something I decided, Jesse. It's something the legislature decided. You can certainly ask them about the pros and the cons. Again, my position is I would love to include them. We have an acute housing crisis in mountain communities. I would say, we made a lot of progress on the population and housing centers and job centers of the state. Some progress in the mountain areas, and we welcome that conversation with more areas. I think it's fair to say the mountain areas are different. One of the areas they're different is there are even more constrained for land than Denver, Aurora, our cities are. What does that mean? Most of the land is public land, is federal land, in fact, in and around our towns. And I think we have some very creative cities and counties that understand the issue. I also want to mention that our mountain rail, which we passed Senator Dylan Roberts carried a tax credit, and then it's one of the things that's funded from the 2 bills that fund rail, the rental car fee and the oil and gas agreement. Mountain rail is not only, which it is, Denver Metro residents access to Winter Park and Steamboat. It's also workers that can afford to live in communities like Craig and Hayden, which are phasing out of coal, would be able to get to job centers like Steamboat easier, quicker, not have to worry about severe winter conditions. And so it's also a solution for helping the needs of communities like Steamboat Springs.
Sorry for moving. I had the sun in my eyes, and I realized I looked like I was white as a ghost. I didn't want people to run here thinking I was going to pass out. So I'm going to move on to construction defects. It's another housing issue that came up at the legislature this year. There was a bipartisan reform bill that was brought, but you didn't really take much of a lead in it. I don't think there was a press event. I don't think you formally endorsed the bill. I wonder why you kind of kept that at arm's length, whereas you were more vocal in support of some of these other housing measures.
Well, I pushed back a little on that, Jesse. I called for construction defects reform in my state of the state, and absolutely we supported the bill. You might be right. I didn't have a press conference, but I don't think I did on, you'd have to check on many of the housing bills. I called for them in the state of the state. It was clear we were supporting it. And it did get through the Senate, and that was good news. But look, I don't think you're going to see that everything the legislature is going to just roll through, going to fold and say we're done with housing. These are all foundations to build on, and the work around parking requirements and accessory dwelling units, absolutely meeting the needs of our mountain communities, meeting the needs of our Denver metro area. Construction defects reform is critical. These are all pieces, and I think we broke through this sort of large roadblock on housing that had paralyzed the state. And we're now moving forward in a big way. And every single element of this, including construction defects, are ways to build on in the future. And we're happy to continue to support that work.
I wonder, there's no secret that you're a very hands-on governor when it comes to the legislative process. And I wonder, if we can expect you to be more out front on this issue, on construction defects next year or whenever the next bill comes up. And I wonder, if, you brokered all these compromises this year, why didn't one happen on this?
Yeah, it would have been nice to make progress on construction defects. It'll also be nice to make progress next year. I think the land use piece was more important because no matter what you do with construction defects, if you don't get permission to build, 40 or 50 or 60 units, it doesn't matter whether it's an apartment or condo because you can't even build it. So we wanted to break through the ability to build multifamily housing near transit, which we did. Now that it's allowed to be built, do we care about the mix between apartments and condos? And is the mix right now skewed towards rental apartments rather than condos? Yes. Do we encourage home ownership? Do we want condo ownership? Yes. Do we want to reduce costs for homeowners? Absolutely. So, the two naturally segue from one to the next, and absolutely there's additional work to do next year. And again, I was very happy that a bill passed the Senate. I did call for that in my State of the State, and I haven't written my next one for January, Jesse, but I think you can place a relatively safe bet. It'll include another call to do work in that area.
All right. I kind of mentioned the deals that were brokered by your office and lawmakers, and I wanted to talk a little bit about those. There were ones on oil and gas, environment, property taxes, lawsuit caps, kind of ran the gamut this year. I wonder, though, if this is really the most transparent way of doing things, rolling out these prepackaged, predetermined agreements, a week or so before the session, and seems to limit public input and scrutiny until it's too late. So, how do you bring the public in? And I wonder if how you would respond to that criticism.
Yeah, so, in cases of these major agreements, we were in many ways trusted intermediaries between warring parties or factions that had vastly different views of the world. Let's take the doctors and hospitals and trial lawyers, right? Both have valid arguments, and we're generally a little bit more on the hospital side, but trusted by both. And we certainly agree that medical malpractice hadn't been increased in however many years and probably needed to be updated just so people who were disabled by a malpractice would be able to support themselves. So some truth on both sides. But the important thing is the initiative, which was not controlled by the legislature, not controlled by us, had to be removed, or the proponents had to decide to roll the dice in November. There's always a high risk when you roll the dice. You never know what the voters of Colorado are going to do. And I think that's the reason they were at the table and ultimately forged an agreement with people on the other side of that issue. The legislative champions on both sides were certainly in the mix. And it wasn't really for, us, in that the legislature or governor weren't the ones who could say, this is what you need to withdraw and not roll the dice in November, which was a very bad initiative, by the way, no caps. I would have opposed that. I made that very clear. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't have passed. I don't know what would have happened. And I told both sides that, right? Who knows? So again, it was an agreement where both sides could live with. And then the legislature, I think, reacted probably the same way I did. And they were very happy to see a reasonable, thoughtful agreement reached rather than an extreme risk at the ballot box that probably made people very uncomfortable. Especially in healthcare, but I'm sure it made those who were injured by medical malpractice, worry too, because they didn't know it would pass.
But is there enough public input, I guess, in this process, right? I'd heard, at least for the oil and gas deal, that it was like a CEO to governor type of discussion, right? Those are calls that the public be a part of. I would say that, there were a number of great grassroots environmental organizations at the table: Earth Guardians, Green Latinos, Conservation Colorado, so many great groups that were at the table. Of course, on the other side, yes, they're companies. That's who extracts oil and gas. It's not a very grassroots activity. There's mineral rights owners who are people who make money from it, but it's fundamentally done by companies. And again, in this case, Jesse, both sides had filed initiatives. I thought both sides had filed initiative that personally, as a voter, I probably would have voted against. I think that both sides, unfiltered, had ideas that were not good for the state.
But both sides also understood, Jesse, that their initiatives might not pass and the other side's might. And that was a huge risk. And that is, again, what brought people to the table to work on a better path forward with the legislative champions of clean air, where what could we actually do on clean air? How could we support a economy-wide reduction in carbon, meaning funding transit, which helps people get where they want to go with lower carbon utilization, decreases the cost of living, affecting ecosystems and protecting outdoor areas from impacts from oil and gas, which this also funds through Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And yes, working with the legislators, working with the proponents on both sides, they were able to reach an agreement to pull down their ballot initiatives and pursue a better path for the state. And I think both sides agreed a better path for them as well.
All right. Well, you always say that you don't look at the ballot measures before they end up on your ballot.
I don't.
Like there were two. There were two. I caught you, and there were two that you might have known a little bit about.
Well, I said this on caps on. I was clear. I think even I had been asked by the press. I said it would be good to avoid this, and I'm not personally supportive of removing all caps on medical malpractice. And so, I'd said that, but I honestly don't read them all, Jesse, till I know what's on the ballot. And that's just true because I have plenty to read. I'm reading, I think, 300 bills right now to decide which ones to sign. And I'm sure I'll sign the vast majority of them.
All right. I'm going to keep asking you about the ballot measures, though. I'm not going to back off on
Well, it's a good topic for a show in like September, for sure.
All right, I'll remember that. Okay, so we got about 5-6 minutes left, and I would hit a few more subjects. So looking forward, you had a real ally in the state Senate and Senate President Steve Fenberg. He's now leaving. He's term limited, and I wonder if you're worried about that making it harder for you to, have the influence that you've had over the legislature in recent years. Are you going to have some other allies? Do you feel like it's going to be harder for you to shape legislation without having somebody, so in your corner in such a top position?
Well, first of all, immense gratitude for Senator Fenberg for his great service. He's somebody I've known a long time. He happens to be my state senator. So even a governor gets a state senator. So he has really done a remarkable job for the state of Colorado. So appreciative of his work. I think we have good relationships with many members of both, Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature. I meet regularly with Democratic leadership and Republican leadership. So whoever is in leadership, we're going to establish a strong relationship with. I've known, Speaker McCluskey a number of years from her work on the school district days, and I've gotten to know Monica Duran, and of course Robert Rodriguez. I've known his father many years, and him to a lesser extent. So we're going to work with whoever both sides elect as leaders, and we're very happy to do that, and grateful for Senator Fenberg's service.
All right, I want to go back to one of the deals that came out and a question of that. One of the provisions in one of the oil and gas deals, the fee bill, I believe it was the fee bill, included a provision in it that required RTD to focus its efforts on completing the rail line up to Adams County and then the rail line up to Longmont. And I wonder, though, how you actually plan to enforce that, or if it's more of like a bully pulpit kind of thing.
Well, I mean, RTD is a construct of the state. Obviously, the state is what gives RTD its authority. There's discussions about how to change that or modify that. Obviously, these funds need to be used to complete projects. That project that was supposed to be completed, I think, in 2017 with regard to Northwest Rail, still is now 7 years behind schedule. And this additional resources for that should help expand RTD service, not just be used to fill holes elsewhere.
But how do you hold their feet to the fire on that? I mean, it's in statute now that they have to prioritize it, but I didn't see like an enforcement mechanism.
Well, it's the law of Colorado, Jesse. The law of Colorado has to be followed. And as I said, what our RTD is a construct of the state. And of course, I think you're going to continue to see a desire among legislators for more accountability for any funds that they give to transit agencies like RTD to make sure that it goes to expanding services for more people.
So the RTD reform bill was something that died in the final days of the legislature. You were often mentioned in that. I wonder if you support that measure coming back next year, and if you think that the board should be shrunk and give yourself some power to appoint members of the RTD board.
Yeah, look, we need every transit agency in the state, but in particular RTD, it's the biggest transit agency in the state. We need to be best of breed, one of the top 10 transit agencies in the country. And sadly, we are not. And yes, that is partially through a very convoluted governance structure that, again, based on objective data from others, is simply not a governance structure that sets them up for success. The state needs RTD to be successful. We are going to step up as funding partners. We need to make sure that they can achieve operational excellence and are one of the best transit agencies in the country.
All right, so in the couple of minutes we have left, I want to ask a couple of forward-looking questions. The EPA has rejected your latest effort to stop the agency from requiring that reformulated gas be sold kind of in the Denver metro area I-25 corridor, basically to Wyoming during summer months. I wonder if there's a next step to your protest or if we're just stuck with paying more for gas now.
So, while I'm very upset that they didn't approve it, they also actually didn't reject it. They are holding it, which means that if there's a supply crisis, which our external analysis that we contracted for shows is very likely, they would presumably grant it. But in that case, it's $1 late and a dime short. They should grant that now. Absent that, this will affect our state through, I believe, September 1st. I'd have to check on the date that it rolls off for summer. And with very unfortunate consequences, including the fact that people will simply drive a little further to get much lower cost gas. Because this is only part of our state. You can go north of Fort Collins, you can go near Greeley, you could go in Colorado Springs. And if there is a major cost differential of, 50 cents.
Well, looks like we might have lost the governor here in the final minute, so.
We got it working.
All right,
Hi, Jeff.
all right.
What I would say is people will drive, depending on where they live. If there's a major differential, it means worse air quality, more miles traveled. You probably saw the letter I wrote. I'm very upset, and we give them every legal way of simply saying you have a 22-day or 1 year abeyance, and they didn't do it, unfortunately. So it is what it is.
All right. Well, let me ask you one last question, since I think you were trying to leave, since you didn't want to answer my last tough question. I wonder how you're feeling about Joe Biden. It's a presidential election year. Some recent polls have raised red flags in swing states across the country. I wonder what advice you might have for the president in terms of how to win this thing, and if you're feeling nervous about his chances in November.
Well, I feel confident for Joe Biden in Colorado. I think he's done a lot of great things as president. We're particularly appreciative of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, long, elusive, bringing Republicans and Democrats together around a major infrastructure package. Grateful for the assistance to states that we've been able to do some very creative things with here. I would encourage him to talk about the future. When I've run for office, I never talk about what I did. I talk about what I want to do in a vision. So, when I was running for governor the first time, I didn't talk at all about what I did in Congress. In fact, I didn't even mention I was a congressperson. The people in my district probably knew it, but in part because Congress isn't that popular. It's even less popular now than when I was in it. But in large part because I wanted to focus on the future. And I said, here's what I want to do: 100% renewable energy by 2040, saving people money on healthcare, cutting the income tax, renewable energy economy, and free preschool and kindergarten, right? And we've stuck to those things. We're doing them. And I, do we take a little victory? Like, hey, we got preschool and kindergarten done. I'll say that, but I'm always focused on the future. We were talking about housing, right? This session, and we're going to continue that. But we immediately pivoted to what the greatest need of the state was, and we're continuing to do that. So talk about the future, excite people about your vision for the future. I think that if President Biden does that well, I think he'll be elected for another term.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you jumping back on for that last question. And you can't see our audience, neither can I, but I'm sure there's a standing ovation for us. But I appreciate your time, Governor, and look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thank you, Jesse. Take care.
All right. Well, I will hand it now back to Brian, and I will see you all in the other room in a minute. Good luck, Brian.
Oh. If I know what to do. Testing. Ooh. All right. So thank you to the governor, of course. We're sad he couldn't make it in person tonight, and thanks to Jesse. Right now we're going to bring up a couple of representatives from the Colorado House. So the first one is Representative Iman Jodeh. She is a Democrat from Aurora, Colorado, I believe, yes. And Representative Anthony Hartsook, who's a Republican from Parker. I think they're both in their first terms in office? No, 4th year. I'm the new one, so that's completely on me. Why don't we put me in the middle?
Okay.
Yeah, why not?
Thank you.
All right, so there's a mic switch. See if these are working.
Hello.
Hello.
Excellent. Nailed it. Okay. Well, let's start with land use. Governor Polis, I think, talked a little bit about that probably. Representative Jodeh, you were one of the lead sponsors on House Bill 1313, which was the Transit-Oriented Communities Bill. It would require a number of cities to effectively zone for more apartments and townhomes near transit stops. There are also some measures to legalize accessory dwelling units in different parts of the state, and also to scale back minimum parking requirements in some areas. So without getting too into the weeds of how things like housing opportunity goals are calculated, right? Tell us a little bit about how much of an impact you expect these proposals to have.
First, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's always great to talk about what we did over the session. You wake up after 120 days, and you need to sleep for 2 weeks. But you know, House Bill 1313, which was the Transit-Oriented Communities Bill that I co-primed in the House with Representative Woodrow, was actually our second round. And if you'll allow me to just get into last year really quick. Last year, we ran Senate Bill 213, which was the largest bill of the legislative session for the governor, which was land use. And land use was essentially Colorado's answer to sustainable planning for decades to come, knowing that the secret's out and Colorado's the best place to live. So unfortunately, we did not make it past the finish line last year. So we came back this year. We had extensive stakeholdering over the summer since May of last year. And we had something called TOC Tuesdays, where we would have stakeholdering of probably 50 or more people on Zoom, making sure that we were really distilling down what essentially 213 2.0 would look like. And the answer to that was House Bill 1313. 1313 essentially made sure that we, just like you mentioned, there was the core of what we wanted to do last year, sustainable land use planning. And then we broke it up. We made sure that there were those satellite bills like ADUs, like parking minimums. And so at the core of this year was 1313. And, you know, for me, the reason why this was a big deal was because we know that currently Coloradans cannot afford to live and work and play and age and worship or do anything of the sort in the communities that they want to live in. It is too expensive. And so approaching it like transit-oriented communities made sure that the state was stepping in and helping municipalities identify where they can sustainably place transit, fixed rail and transit, so that we were having housing opportunity goals for each municipality. This was planning for decades in the future, again, to make sure that people can afford to live in the communities that they want to. I will just say one last thing.
Please do.
Minnesota, I believe, had something similar to this. This bill went way beyond that and is now probably has set the bar for the nation when it comes to land use planning. And I'm incredibly proud to do something like that for Colorado, because now we can be the blueprint of what sustainable growth will look like, which will ultimately help not only affordable housing, but our climate, less cars on the road, people live where they want, and that kind of thing.
So let me ask you this. Why not leave it up to cities, right? In Colorado, much of the country, zoning has long been a local government issue. Why not let people who live in Golden or Highland Ranch decide for themselves how their communities grow and develop, right? Like, not everyone wants to live in an apartment, in a condo. Not everyone likes urban density, right? Like my parents back in Dallas, they love their Dallas suburb and driving everywhere and having 100 parking spots at the grocery store, right?
It's a great question. So I think this was one of the misconceptions about the Transit-Oriented Communities Bill. It was, in fact, an opportunity for municipalities to feel empowered to make these decisions for themselves. What we did was essentially set guidelines, right? Was to say, here are some benchmarks that we would like you to meet. We have created an incredibly long runway to make sure that municipalities can plan, meet, and achieve these goals. And even if they don't, we still provide more time to help them navigate that process. Now, again, because that was such a misconception about 1313, a great way that I like to think about it was in my district in Aurora. So one thing we heard from Arapahoe County, who they were amazing in the process, which is my county, but they said, how are we supposed to make a TOC when the light rail station is on I-25? How are we supposed to have a radius of housing around I-25? And I gave them the example of my district. I hope you guys know where this is. If not, I'll try and paint the picture. On Parker Road, on the ramp to 225, there is affordable housing, okay? There's the light rail station, and on the other side of that light rail station is, in fact, 225. That is not a great example of where Aurora would put a TOC, right? And that's what I mean by empowering municipalities. We wanted to make sure that they would identify where in their city would be best to meet these housing opportunity goals. Clearly, that place in my district wouldn't be one of them.
All right, so Representative Hartsook, I want to get your thoughts on land use and housing as well. You and your Republican colleagues voted against most of the bills that we've been talking about, right? You did support, I believe, Senate Bill 174, which was looking at kind of housing needs assessments. Is that correct? Yeah. And that one would require cities to kind of study their own housing needs and eventually make some action plans to figure out how they want to address them. But why were the major Democratic land use proposals so objectionable to you and your colleagues?
Thanks, Brian, and good evening, everybody. There was a lot of great bipartisan bills that came through this session. This was not one of them, nor was 213, as was talked about last session. And the reason that, as Republicans, were against that is we believe that local governments have your planning commissions, your municipalities, and they should decide what is best for their communities. If you look out the window behind you, you see beautiful mountains and beautiful areas. We live in Colorado for this. We do not live in Colorado for high-density housing. People don't move here to live in high-rises. They move here for the open spaces. There's a philosophical difference in how we view on the Republican side of the state government mandating things versus the citizens at the local government being involved in deciding what's going to be built in their community. And that's why we were not in support of these bills. We look at housing. If you want to fix housing, then work on construction defects. Work on the regulations and the limitations that are impacting what can be built and give the local municipalities more tools to do their jobs versus things being driven by the Gold Dome up there in Denver. And that's why we look at, and we don't like these kinds of ideas where the state is mandating this is how our things are going to be done. One of the big things in 1313 was the carrot and the stick. We eliminated a lot of the stick out of there, but the big piece in that original piece of policy was that they could take the taxes, the road taxes from the local municipalities if they did not play ball with the way the state wanted it. And so that was the coercive action. And we don't like that. We don't see that's how it should be done. When you create another form of government for these transit-oriented communities, and they're going to take tax money, which is taxpayers' money, from the local counties and the municipalities and say, we know better how to spend it than you, the county and municipality, we fundamentally disagree with that. So that's why we did not support the bills.
A quick follow-up question here. So would you agree with Governor Polis that we do have housing supply problem when we think about our affordability challenges here in Colorado? And if so, how do you think that we as a state should be addressing that?
Thanks again. And like I just mentioned a minute ago, construction defects. I mean, when there was a reform law that went in several years ago, the construction defects basically make it cost prohibitive to build your entry-level places like condos and townhomes. Those were what were known as starter places for people to buy before they moved into single-family homes. Construction defects law said that if one thing failed, then you could have a lot of class action lawsuits against the builder. Builders went, I'm not going to build something if I can be sued 10, 20, 30 years down the line. That's just, from a business perspective, doesn't make sense. So that's number one, that we need to look at changing that construction defect to help with the housing problem. Is there a housing problem here? Yes. What has caused that? There's been a huge influx of people moving here. You can see across every demographic that's here, predominantly coming out of California. There's a lot of people that are moving to Colorado. As was mentioned, I mean, it's beautiful looking outside these windows. And even if you live out on the rural, out on the eastern plains, down south, you live on the western slopes, people love to come to Colorado. We have a lot of outdoor activities. We have a lot of benefits. That housing isn't just confined to the metro area. It's across the state. There are housing problems everywhere. What we need to do is overhaul that construction defect law and let the local communities and the planning boards do their planning, issue the building permits. We streamline that process so they can build the houses, and especially the entry-level affordable ones like the condominiums and the townhomes, so people can get a start and then move into larger homes. Thank you.
Another real quick housing question. Representative Jodeh, a lot of what we're talking about is kind of aimed at laying the groundwork for more construction, right? Which hopefully leads to more affordability. Higher density zoning means you can put more units on the same amount of land, fewer parking spots, same concept, right? So these are all kind of supply strategies. We're gonna build more houses and that'll make it a little bit less expensive. Do you think the legislature accomplished enough on what I'll call capital A affordable housing? And this is like publicly subsidized units for working class, low income families that can't afford market rates?
Yeah, it's a great question. And here's the thing, is that we were very intentional about coming back from last year and ensuring that we baked in anti-displacement and affordability, right? That was a really big thing, and especially as a person of color in the legislature, that is something that people of color experience way more. And so, again, wanting folks to live and work in the communities that they want needs to make sure that we are not displacing people, because that also means increasing density. Now, when we talk about increasing density, and I agree with the representative, like I said, the secret's out, right? This is the best place to live, and it is because of what you see behind you. But TOCs and development does not mean high rises. Last year, when we were talking about land use, I have constituents emailing me saying, so you're telling me that my neighbor can tear down their house and we can build a high rise? I'm like, no, that's definitely not what that means, for a few reasons. And it's still in 1313. There are aesthetics, and you have to follow code and all of these things, right? So if you actually think about a 3-story building with a couple hundred units, that's what TOC is, right? Very aesthetically pleasing. These things are not anything that are gonna block our beautiful view. And we were very intentional about what upzoning looks like. And so, again, when we talk about all of these things, we have to make sure that building in anti-displacement ensures that vulnerable communities and vulnerable people, whether senior citizens or people of color or first-generation immigrants and refugees, what have you, do not feel essentially targeted by legislation that we put forth in order to make sure that we are sustainably planning for decades to come.
Well, let's pivot to tax policy. I'll try not to put everyone to sleep. Representative Hartsook, you had supported the measure that would reinstate income tax cuts as kind of one of the default automatic taxpayer refund mechanisms. But you did not support a companion measure couple companion measures actually, that redistribute a lot of TABOR refunds to low-income families through things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, Child Tax Credit. And I think you also support the property tax cut bill. Is that right? Yes, sir. So taking all that together, how do you feel about the tax package the legislature passed? I mean, do you view kind of the totality as, you know, the sort of tax relief that you want and your constituents want, or is it kind of a little bit of a mixed bag?
Thanks, Brian. It's a little bit of a mixed bag. If you look at last year, the session ended, property taxes were a huge issue. It fell out with 213, and then we ended with Proposition HH, which went down in a huge defeat. We got called into a special session to look at property taxes. This is one of those bipartisan bills that everyone came away going, I don't like it, I don't love it, but everyone gave up something and everyone got something. That's how legislation works. If you have one winner and one loser, probably not a good piece of legislation. When everybody walks away going, I had to give up something, then that helps. Property taxes are from people who own property, whether it's businesses or residential. Those rates, without, like you said, getting in boring, putting everybody to sleep, and we don't have enough time to go through it all night, it's very complicated, it's very convoluted, and yet people are looking at their tax bill going, I don't care how convoluted it is, all I see is my bill skyrocketing by 30, 40, 50% or more in some cases. That's what they were looking at. So what we tried to work on with the tax commission and these tax cuts was to see how can we go across all of this. Some of it's going to involve tightening of belts at the local level because some of the backfills went away. Post-COVID, taxpayer money from the federal government was pushed down. There was a lot of cash flow from the feds that could be distributed. That is since gone. Colorado has a balanced budget. Every one of you have a balanced budget at home. You have to operate within your means. So does Colorado. And we are now looking at saying, we got to operate within our means, and how are we going to cut this? And the state is saying, okay, municipalities, you have to do the same thing. You've got to learn to operate within your means. You can't keep doling out so much money to different areas that was being passed down as a pass-through basically from the federal government. Does that mean everyone is going to have to tighten their belt and cinch up? Yep. Does it mean that the cost of living is increasing? It is, especially here in Colorado. What we need to look at is how do we increase the income for people? How do we increase their ability to get a better paying job? One of the great bipartisan bills that we worked on in the education was the workforce bill that gets on, and I love sitting up here in the front row because Dr. Piccone knows exactly where we're talking about. This is where you go through the universities, or you get into a trade program, or you get a certificate coming out of high school, so you get into a paying job. You are out there making money for yourself, paying your bills, and living your life. That's how you start paying things off and doing stuff versus waiting for the government to do things. Helping that pipeline feed engineering, feed construction, feed the trades, all of that is important. And those are the bipartisan bills that we worked on, and that will help Coloradans make more money and get a better quality of life out there.
All right, Representative Jodeh. On the one hand, I find it very interesting that Democrats have, I wrote an article about this, but I find it interesting that Democrats seem to have found a way to almost reimagine TABOR as a vehicle for progressive tax policy in some sense, right? I mentioned the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, couple years, last year, last year. We'll call it last year. Y'all flattened the Tabor refunds, right? So, on the other hand, the state is at its spending limit, and we're not funding Medicaid providers adequately to prevent clinic closures. We're still not funding K-12, higher ed, preschool at the level that I think at least most Democrats would like, right? And budget staff are projecting operating deficits as soon as 25, 26, right? Where do you think the state should go from here? Is it more, just working with Tabor refunds and finding ways to achieve policy goals through that? Or are we at the point in a relatively strong economy where you think Democrats should be focusing on, okay, how do we actually fund public services at the level that you want to?
The very short and best answer I can give you is repeal Tabor. Like, everything that you have just mentioned is a result of the chokehold Tabor has on the Colorado economy. If Tabor was not in place, we would have very beautiful roads and strong bridges. Our schools would be completely funded. We wouldn't have to worry about funding Medicaid, all of these things, right? I remember, and I think it was Arizona, and don't quote me on that, but their governor came out to see how we were doing with Tabor, and they ran away. And they realized that is not something that is good for a state. I think Tabor is really what has made and forced the hands of Democrats to do, in fact, what you are saying, is to get creative with how we can fund basic services for our children, for our communities, for our sustainability and our infrastructure. Those are the things that we need to make sure that happen. And yes, as Representative Weissman would say, a tax document is a moral document. Tax code is a moral code. He's way smarter than I am. But this is the reality, right? And I think I literally remember in college, and I won't say when, we were literally campaigning actively against Tabor, right? Because we knew the effects that this would have in higher education as college students. And so this has reverberated through decades of what Colorado needs. And I hate to say it, but I'm looking at this young lady right here, and she's gonna be the person that's gonna continue to pay for it. When we had our Tabor refunds, I talked to the governor and I was like, maybe we should give that to the people that need it the most. And he said, yeah, everyone should get an equal share. And I'm like, but maybe the people who need it the most. And so it's kind of this unfortunate gift that keeps giving lumps of coal.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say you do not want to repeal Tabor. But look,
69% of the people don't want to repeal Tabor.
So your party has been, very consistently in favor of cutting taxes. I will point out, though, that Republicans have also celebrated things like eliminating the budget stabilization factor, fully funding schools, which largely happened as a result of this rise in property taxes that we've seen. What's your take on all this, right? There's certainly a tension there between the government services that the state is trying to deliver and kind of this, I would say, bipartisan pressure right now to cut taxes, right? It's not just Republicans saying we need to cut property taxes.
No, you're absolutely right. From a philosophical perspective and polling, the Colorado Polling Institute did a poll just here in March. 69% of the people want the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It's the most popular thing. It's in the Constitution. Now, if people don't like it, then there is a way to repeal it. I'm not advocating that, but it's in the Constitution, so we have to follow it because it is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. It's people's money. We did work on some bipartisan legislation. I sit on the Education Committee, and that was one of the great things that we did was overhaul the entire funding structure for education. It used to be where it funded systems, and we now have it funding students. So rural communities, cities, everybody, that was one of the things that it took a long time to get through, but that was one of the most significant overhauls that we did in a bipartisan support to get that over the finish line. And there's another great example. Not everybody was happy because they all had to give something up, and that's the way life goes. But it benefited the students, and in the long run, things will play out. We'll see how the economy goes. But getting rid of that budget stabilization factor and getting things to where it's funding the student and following their education is far better than stuff that is based on systems. Philosophically, as Republicans, we look towards the future. We believe a lot in individual self-initiative. We believe in giving you tools to succeed. We kind of, by and large, don't like the government telling us what to do. We don't like the government taking taxpayers' money and then redistributing it somewhere else. That's why we see a lot of tax cuts, that we think it belongs in your pocket. We think you should decide where you want to spend it. Community efforts, church efforts, those are things at the ground level, the organizational level of the basic community structure is where those things happen best, not at the Gold Dome. Because you've got 65 of us sitting up there in the House chamber that have ideas that are going to be very different than what the people are actually on the ground living. And we, at least from our philosophical perspective, we don't think the 65 should be telling the 6+ million in the rest of the state of how to live.
We are at time. I want to thank you both so much for coming up here. This was really great. Next, we have Jesse Paul, live and in person. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Thank you. You're great.
All right, they're walking up, so I'll introduce them. This is Senator Jim Smallwood, a Parker Republican, joining me to my right. I guess that's politically appropriate. You got a microphone? You do. And then Senator Kyle Mullica, a North Glen Thornton Democrat. Thanks again to DU for everything. This is great. They're great partners of ours. All right, well, let's go right into it. At the end of the session, I was looking around the room, and I realized that there were going to be no more Democrats that had served in the minority and no more Republicans except for Larry Liston, but he's kind of an asterisk, that had served in the majority in the Senate. And that's a big change. When I first started covering the legislature, things had flipped. The Senate was in Republican control, and that only lasted for, I guess, the first 2 years of your term, Senator Smallwood. And I guess the question is for you, you're not going to be, your term limited, you're not going to be back in January. God bless you, praise the Lord, right? But, what do you think the effect of that is going to be on the legislature, not having that kind of institutional knowledge and background of kind of the tables being turned? And I think you might, is your mic on?
That work now?
Yeah.
It shouldn't surprise anybody that Jesse did not give me a microphone that works. So. No, thank you everybody for having me. It's a great question. So there's a certain humbleness I think that you get when you've been in the majority and then lost the majority, and you've experienced actually needing to govern, which is what you need to do in the majority. And then there's so many people that have only served in the minority, where basically your job is just defense all the time, right? They just fight. They don't really have to worry about making good policy. They don't have to worry about governing, because nothing that you do in the minority from an offensive perspective really matters, right? There's no bills that can be passed in a partisan way when you're in the minority. So I will say that piece is humbling, as well as kind of from more 30,000 foot. Like when I got elected back in 2016, I was one of those very pro term limit types of guys, right? Like, you should only be in office for 4 years and then get out of there because you're wasting time and taxpayer money. And now that I've been there for 8 years, I'm like, wow, that was really, really juvenile to be thinking, because it takes like 4 years to figure out where the bathrooms are and where the parking lots are, and to start to just get your bearings, and then to have any influence at all takes like 5 or 6 years, and then to be sort of known as somebody who can actually help craft policy and get some I don't want to say respect, that's probably not the right word, but at least some clout maybe, and people take you seriously. I don't think happened for me. First of all, it probably didn't happen for me if we ask Senator Mullica. But if it were to have happened for me, it probably was only my last year or two there. And then, you gain all that institutional knowledge and then they boot you out. And the problem with that big picture is that what happens is as everybody leaves after 4, 6, 8 years, the only people in the building, I don't care if you're talking about DC or the Colorado State Capitol, the only people that have the institutional knowledge is the lobby. The lobbyists are the ones that have all the knowledge and therefore have all the power. So it's, it's
And the journalists, you don't give us enough credit. Yeah. No, it is a really interesting conversation because people think of term limits and they don't think of who has the institutional knowledge in the building. It's a nonpartisan staff. And I will mention there were some state senators who never learned where the bathrooms were even after 5 or 6 years. But that's for another day.
Not Republicans, for the record.
That's true. Senator Mullica, so I think you have a reputation of maybe helping bring your party down to earth on some issues, right? And so, from your perspective, right, you're now going to be in a legislature where there are no Democrats who remember being in the minority, who maybe tailored their political beliefs or their votes to kind of recognize that things can switch at some point. So I wonder how you're viewing kind of the next few years. You're losing Fenberg, you're losing Fields, you're losing Janal. What do you think things are going to look like?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're losing a lot of institutional knowledge and a lot of legislators who are really good at this job. And one sitting to my right right now, I'm serving on health committee with Senator Smallwood, even though we're opposite parties. He is an extremely intelligent individual and he knows the issues. And I think that it makes me a little nervous that we're losing some of that knowledge. But I think my mindset has always been down there, and it feels really simplistic, but it kind of doesn't happen a lot, is to treat others the way you would want to be treated. I often try to put myself in those shoes or in the minority shoes of how would I want to be treated if I was in the minority? Would I want people to come talk to me? Would I want people to try to give me an opportunity to represent my district and maybe have some influence so that I can go home and talk about some things that I've done for my district? And I think that goes a long way. It doesn't mean we always agree, and we shouldn't agree. But I think that when you have that mindset, it does help out with relationship building down there. And and I was talking to a constituent of mine the other day, and the reason I go down there with that mindset is because that's what my constituents told me to do when I was knocking on the doors. They said, "We're tired of the hyperpartisanship. We want you to get things done, and we want you to work with people to get things done." And I think that when you look at politics, and I'm sure Senator Smallwood, even Jesse, I'm sure you can speak to this, that oftentimes it's a lot harder to stand up against your own party than it is even the other party. It's actually easier when a Republican does something to stand up against that because they're the opposite party, but to stand up against your own party and say, "Hey, no, you're going too far here. This isn't really representative of my district." That takes some courage. And I think what I'm trying to get through to my side is that we have to continue having that big tent that has gotten us to where we are today. Because if we shrink that, and if we kind of go into this cancel culture and saying it's either this way or the highway, I think that we really run the risk of losing a lot of good people that are trying to get involved. And I don't think that's representative of Colorado either. I think that when you go out and you get out of that silo of the Capitol or that echo chamber, and you're talking to people in your communities and you're knocking on doors, you find out that the vast majority of people maybe are right on one issue and maybe left on another issue, but they're right in the middle, and they're not the extremes that oftentimes get a lot of press in politics. And that's what I try to represent, and it doesn't always make you the most popular person, especially amongst some of my colleagues. But I feel like that's what I was sent down there to do, and I have the privilege and the honor of representing a district I grew up in, and I think that I feel proud of that, and I hope that we start getting more like that and start going down that path.
Let me stay with you, Senator Mullica. I wanted to ask kind of about Capitol culture. There was a lot of, I think, anxiety heading into the session about what was going to happen, and most of it kind of stayed behind the scenes, but under the surface, there was a lot of frustrations with each other. I wonder, you've been there for a few years now, how you're feeling about the culture at the Capitol. If things are worse off than when you began, or maybe you've just been around and you're sticking your fingers in things you shouldn't or whatever. But how do you think things have progressed in your time there?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting dynamic right now at the Capitol. So the House has a supermajority of Democrats. The Senate is one seat away from being a supermajority, and then we have the governor, who's also a Democrat. And so, just complete control. And to me, that comes a great responsibility. And a big piece of that responsibility is to not abuse that or to not go too far. And I think that there's probably a disagreement sometimes amongst Democrats of if maybe a mandate was issued and the voters have issued that mandate to kind of do as much as you can and go kind of to your corner as much as you can. I tend to disagree there. I think that the political environment that Colorado's in isn't purely just because Democrats are good and we govern in a better way. I think partially, the ecosystem is a little messed up because of national politics, and we've seen that, and I think that it's very apparent that Colorado is middle of the road, and that certain former presidents aren't all that popular here, and I think that there's been a number of things that have shifted that ecosystem, and I don't think that shift is permanent. And so my goal is to say, okay, we are in control, and we have that power, but how do we still govern appropriately? How do we still make sure that people feel like they're being heard, even sometimes when they may disagree with you? I think that when you're able to have that conversation and you're able to say, what are your thoughts, that even at the end of that conversation, if you disagree, the animosity isn't as high. And you're able to walk away from that at least feeling like you were heard, and then oftentimes walk away from that finding that compromise and finding that middle ground. And I think that that's something, and that's just something I think in human nature that when we have the power that we do, that's something that internally my side of the aisle is working through, and and I'm not the only one that kind of I think has that mindset. I think that there are others. And I think that it's just going to continuously, we just have to continuously focus on that and make sure that that we're still governing appropriately.
How about you, Senator Smallwood? Is the Capitol a better or worse place to work 8 years after you started?
That wasn't one of the planned questions we talked about beforehand, Jesse. So I haven't given it much thought. Honestly, I've never found the Capitol to be an unpleasant place, and Senator Mullica knows this. Like, there aren't, after 8 years of being there, both in the majority and the minority, chairing committees and now being, just a garden variety member of committees, like generally, at least in the Senate, and I've never served in the House. Senator Mullica served in the House first, which is a little more raucous and a lot more people and a lot more partisan and a lot more homogeneous for your own district, right? When your district is really, really small, you're not having to appeal to as broad of a demographic of voter. But I've always found the Senate to be a really, really civil place. There's only 35 people. You get to know each other personally, right? Like I think I see Senator Mullica's kids more than I see my own kids. For example, I think we, you're sitting literally this close to people for 120 consecutive days, and yeah, you're talking policy, but you're also talking about your personal lives, what your kids are doing, what your families are doing, what your constituents are saying about a certain issue, and hey, this is really bad for North Denver, or hey, this is really good for Weld County, right? And you hear people speak in a real passionate way about their districts, about their families, about their neighbors. You'd have to be pretty soulless, I think, to not absorb some of that and realize that there's 35 people that are there that really, I think, genuinely, other than one person, all want to do what's best for everybody in the state. And I say that a little tongue-in-cheek. We're really a lot more friendly than I think most people could ever imagine, right? It's extremely collegial. And so I found that when we were in the majority, and I learned great lessons there, as Senator Mullica said, about respect. Like, because when we were in the majority, the House was still run by Democrats. So there was nothing we could do in the majority unilaterally that would get us anywhere. If we did anything that was even sniffed of partisanship, it would die in the House, right? So we even in the majority, had to really take the other party into account. And so I found the experience to be generally quite sane. I made a couple of, I think, lifelong friendships, which I didn't think would happen when I got there. And yeah, I mean, there were some huge bumps along the way. I mean, talk about restroom fiascos and that type of stuff, right? That's anytime you get human beings together, there's a lot of imperfection there. But I've found the culture to be, again, wonderful. It was some of the best years of my life for sure. So I don't really have any regrets on that side.
That's nice to hear.
Now the journalists, we haven't talked about the media yet. That's a whole thing.
I don't know what you're up to at the Capitol. I wish I had a Mayberry time at the Capitol. So we have kind of this is a special opportunity. Both of you are kind of experts in healthcare and health insurance. And Senator Mullica, you're an emergency room nurse, is your day job. You're also a University of Denver graduate, so I should point that out too. Go Colorado College. I want to start with you. I wonder where you see the healthcare conversation going at the Capitol, and maybe where you would like to see the healthcare conversation going at the Capitol, because I know maybe there's some disconnect there. But this year wasn't such a big healthcare year. Previous years have been, but I think that's going to come back up in the future.
Yeah, no, thank you. And to Professor Maskett, who, we were talking earlier, and I had taken a class when I was undergrad here, and so really excited to be back and showing my kids where mom and dad where our dorms were and everything. And so, I do. I agree. I think we did see more of a quiet year, and I think partially that's because, one, affordability in housing, and buying down the BS factor with education really was taking center stage. But I also think that what we were looking at is that we've made some huge changes, and I think that there was a consensus of, let's see what the impact of some of these laws that we've passed already are. I think that the next path that we have to go down now is workforce development. I think that when we're looking at healthcare and we are looking at making sure that we're providing adequate access and the healthcare that the people of Colorado deserve, we have to make sure that we're investing in our workers and the people who care for them. And I think we're starting to see that. We were able to pass a bill this year that created a new medical school up at the University of Northern Colorado, along with some other investments for nursing programs at Metro State and down in the San Luis Valley, and then the vet school up at CSU. I also think that we're going to have to see a huge focus on what that burnout looks like for our healthcare workers and protecting our healthcare workers. We're starting to see violence in the workplace become a real issue, and we're starting to lose healthcare workers at a rapid rate. And so I think that that's kind of the next frontier, and I'm sure there's going to be other things, from an insurance perspective and whatnot that'll be looked at. But in my opinion, I think a huge focus needs to be on our workforce and how do we not only attract new folks into the workforce, but how do we protect those who are already here? Because I think without them, we're not going to be able to get the care that we need. And so,
do you think maybe in recent years the legislature has passed bills that offer specific criminal protections, right, for election workers, public officials? Do you think that's coming for healthcare workers?
Yeah, so we have that in certain aspects in healthcare. So in the ER, it's an elevated offense if you assault a person that works in the ER. There's a strong push for a lot of criminal justice reform that is going on, and so I think that creating new penalties and new laws may not be palatable, and so I think those are going to be conversations that continue. But we're going to have to find a way to protect these healthcare workers. Obviously, coming out of the pandemic, that's extremely hard, and now still being understaffed from a lot of folks leaving the profession or retiring, and then the violence piece, I think it's a perfect storm. And if we don't really address it, then I think we're going to be in a really bad situation. And so I think it's going to be something that we have to focus on as a state.
Nobody knows health insurance like you do. I mean, it's actually, some people might think it's boring, but when you stand up and talk about these health bills, it feels like, no offense, you're one of the only people that understand in the room, kind of what's going on, and you explain to folks. Maybe talk about some of your disappointments in recent years. I know the Colorado option was something that you were pretty disappointed in, and how you're seeing that play out, and what you think the legislature needs to do to maybe rein that in, or reinsurance it came up at the end of session. There was the Tabor issue. It's like a $34 million oopsie that had to come out of the budget. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's high praise, Jesse. Thank you. So it was $34 million a year times 2 years. So it's actually $60-some million in an error on that. So I've had a lot of frustrations on the health insurance and the healthcare side. It's and again, Sarah Mullica knows this. I'm sort of a one-trick pony in the Capitol. It is what I've spent 31 years dealing almost exclusively with population health management and the financing of health insurance, health plans for employers, municipalities, not-for-profits, you name it. I mean, this stuff has gotten ridiculously expensive. And again, I saw it decades ago when I got interested in politics, going, what are we doing? Like, everything we're trying is not only not working, it's making the problem actually worse. I remember I wrote an article for a newspaper almost 20 years ago, and it was designed to be hyperbolic at the time, talking about, hey, if you're not careful, the cost of health insurance for a family is going to exceed what families earn on average. And back then, the number was like $30,000. Well, here we are in 2024, and the average cost of a family's annual insurance premium is $30,000. $30,000. After the Affordable Care Act and all of this kind of stuff. So, I saw it back then and was panicked enough about it then, and I looked to see what we've done in the state to help reverse that tide. And all we've done, by and large, is throw more gas on that fire. I appreciate Senator Mullica's comments about workforce and protecting not only the frontline workers, but to make sure that there are hospitals here when we need it, to make sure that there are doctors here when we need it, to make sure that when you call 911, an ambulance shows up, right? Like, access to healthcare is something that in this country, we've gotten candidly kind of spoiled about. Unless you live in rural or frontier Colorado, here in the metro or in the Front Range, we're kind of spoiled. Like, I can probably walk to 2 hospitals from my house in Parker, right? There's a lot of access. What we don't have is affordability. And so when the Affordable Care Act was passed, I always say they should have named it the Accessible Care Act, not the Affordable Care Act, because it did a lot for accessibility, but it did nothing for affordability. So when I see initiatives happen at the state level here, and more mandates every year saying, we've got to cover more, we've got to cover infertility, because infertility is important. And I say, yes, infertility is important for people, but it's expensive. IVF is $40,000, and if you need it twice, it's $80,000. So yes, it's important, but it's really, really expensive. And people aren't talking to me about accessibility as much as they are affordability nowadays, right? You can have the best health plan in the world out there, but if you can't afford it, it doesn't do you much good. So I don't know how many folks here even know or are interested, and I don't want to get into the esoteric here, but when they passed the Colorado option plan a few years ago, that plan mandated that health insurance rates in our state are lowered by 5% every year. And what has happened is they've gone up every year to the tune of like 10% every year. So it's not only have they not gone down, they haven't even stayed flat, they haven't even stayed close to flat. So these are I mean, all kinds of ways to look at it. You could say they're strategic errors or blunders, or maybe they're just political moves. But the problem that I see now is that because we haven't done the little things right, now we're to the point where something like single payer is gaining more and more traction, because if you can't afford your health insurance, you might be the most staunch conservative on the planet. If you can't afford your own health insurance, at some point you're going to start clamoring for the government to take over and take control. And the problem with single payer, and I was a kid that grew up in Europe. My mom's German. She was naturalized after I was a baby, right? So I've lived the European healthcare system. It's affordable. It's not all that accessible. And a lot of Europeans, including my uncle who passed away a few years ago, would tell you that the quality is nothing like it is in the United States. So we've got this weird teeter-totter going on now where if we want all three legs of the three-legged stool, right? We want quality, we want accessibility, and we want affordability. And it's like every time we build two legs, we knock out the third, so then we add the third and knock out the first. And so, if I'm ever coronated king, I'll have my own plans on how we handle healthcare and health insurance in our state, and it'll be probably the polar opposite of what we've seen today, because I'm as worried about affordability and accessibility as anybody else. But what I'm terrified of is to have a small state like Colorado, right? We're 6 million people out of 360 million. We're a pretty small state. And to see us do something like move a single payer initiative forward and have the healthcare professionals, the doctors and the nurses and the radiologists and the hospital system themselves saying, well, if you're gonna mandate how much we can earn, we're not gonna stay in Colorado. You know, it's a pretty short drive to Albuquerque or to Cheyenne or to Salt Lake City or to Wichita. I mean, we don't live in a vacuum here in Colorado, and to think that doctors and hospitals are gonna stay here and be okay with their reimbursement rates being slashed in order to give people all three legs of that three-legged stool, I think we're kidding ourselves.
Can I ask you a quick, you can totally reject this, but one of the things that I've noticed at the Capitol, there's so much talk about housing affordability. They talk about property taxes. They talk about, affordability measures when we talk about healthcare. No one talks about home insurance, right, which is rising really quickly. And are there any solutions that the legislature can do to tackle that? I mean, property taxes are going up, yes, so are people's home insurance rates, though, too.
Yeah, so, I mean, property insurance in general, I think it's probably not safe to lump it all together, because I think we have done some things. Like, we passed a really, I think, novel car insurance bill this year. I'm not sure if you saw that. That said, if you get a traffic infraction, as opposed to getting points on your driving record and that being submitted to the car insurance company for them to raise your rates, you can instead choose voluntarily to do more driver's education. Going to be a drag, right? Nobody wants to go back to, I shouldn't say nobody. I don't want to go back to driver's ed. Some of you might want to. But if it means that my car insurance rates aren't going to go up by $60 a month, well, guess what? I'm happy to go back. So I think there's some kind of cool little novel things that we could do in some areas. The problem that we have in Colorado is really natural disasters. I mean, we're one of the worst hail states in the union. The wildfires are becoming hugely problematic in areas of our state. So homeowners insurance itself, probably needs more consumer engagement, because the problem I think we all have with consumers when it comes to homeowners insurance, and we saw this with some of the fires, is when we shop homeowners insurance, we look to see what's cheapest very often. That's a good insurance company and the rates are lowest, I'm going to go there. Not actually getting into the weeds of your own policy to say, is this enough coverage for me to rebuild my house if it burns to the ground, like what happened to our neighbors up north here? And it turns out for so many, the cheapest policy wasn't nearly enough to do that. So I think there's a tremendous amount of consumer education that needs to happen, maybe more so than more legislation, which has proven to, in my opinion at least, to be quite ineffective at that.
I will say, after the Marshall Fire, we increased our coverage on our house to the point where my house burned down. I'd have a very nice new house, so. That's not an insurance fraud precursor out there for my insurance company. Okay, we've got a couple minutes left, so I guess just quickly, I want to ask Senator Mullica, next year, if there's one bill that you could pass, what would it be?
Next year, if there's one bill that I can pass, what would it be? I guess I'm going to go back to the workforce safety. This interim, I really want to focus on coming up with that policy and what can we do to truly protect our healthcare workers and to make sure that we're doing all that we can to keep them in the workforce. I think that's going to be a big thing that I spend a lot of my summer doing, and it's a difficult needle to thread, and it's going to be some difficult conversations, but that's going to be something that I'm going to really focus on, because I think it's needed, and I think that it's one of those things where you can see on the horizon what's potentially happening and trying to stop from getting to that point. And so that'll be something I really focus on.
All right, I'll give you a choice of questions. You can answer both or either or. One bill that was passed in the past 8 years that you would undo, or what was your favorite thing that you ever accomplished in the legislature?
I would say favorite bill. So part of this is, I think, what makes me sometimes unpopular in my party is I like to go after the big social issues with a different little twist on it to try to find bipartisan ways of fixing things. So when it comes to things like violence across our state, you know, and my colleagues on the left are like, we need to ban all the guns. And the people on the right say, no, we need to have more guns. Right? What I like to do is come in between to say, you know, the common thread seems to be mental health in a lot of cases. So, you know, what can we do there? What can we do as far as additional mental health beds? What can we do here? So, but between that and I would say on the abortion front, the most fun I had was, you know, again, the left is we need to have legal abortions up to the day of delivery. The right says life begins at the moment you fall in love. All right, so we've got this wide chasm here between the left and the right, and where we were able to get a lot of good bipartisan work done is on, okay, once you have a newborn baby, and I think we all agree once a baby's actually out and in diapers that we can have this conversation about what do we do for those babies who, at least in my county, ended up far too frequently killed by their mothers who didn't want to have children and didn't realize it till later, didn't have the understanding of what to do. So we were able to do 3 different bills on safe haven for newborns, expanding that. And for me, what that did was at least prove that there is middle ground on these big social issues. It might not make everybody happy, or it might make everybody very unhappy. But if you spend enough time with it and have enough conversations with people on both sides, you can find areas where you agree. And so between those 2 issues, I'll look back and go, there's promise in this country. We're not as divided as we think we are. So appreciate the question on that, because very few people, I think, would have even paid attention to some of those little bills.
Yeah, that is interesting. It was a big change in state law. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate it, Senators. Thank you, Aponte and Busam. I have a note that's coming here. Voter voices, yes. If you have not filled out, help us cover the 2024 election, please. Fill out the survey. We're asking questions of candidates and incumbents who are running for office. And we really need you to fill this out so we can ask the right questions and do our best in the coverage. Thanks again to the senators. Thanks to representatives. Thanks to Jared Polis. Thanks to University of Denver. Thank you, Aponte and Busam. Thank you, Christina Pritchett. Thank you, everybody who made this event possible. Thank you, Brian, who wants to go watch the Mavs. Please become a Colorado Sun member and help us make more events like this possible. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you at the next one. Thank you.